Well, good morning. If this is morning for you, as it is for my guest, Michael Mays, good afternoon in Europe, good evening in Asia, and good middle of the night in Australia and New Zealand. I'm Fred Plotkin. This is Fred Plotkin on Fridays on idagio.com/live, where I have very inspiring, enjoyable guests to join me each week where inspiration is the theme, but music is always the common denominator. And there is no more delightful guest that I can imagine on my whole list than my friend Michael Mays, who you see in front of you. Michael is somewhere in Colorado in an undisclosed location and just told me that he will be moving to South Carolina pretty soon. We're going to talk about that. But Michael is, and all of these adjectives apply, a singular, outstanding American baritone. And you in the audience will figure out why by the time we're done. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for getting up early,
My
although
pleasure, man. Glad to
not
be here.
early for you. Um, as listeners in other parts of the world will immediately recognize, Michael speaks with a Texan accent.
Yes.
Michael is from Texas, and he's from a town called Cut and Shoot, Texas.
Yeah, cool. You say cut and shoot. You know,
Cut and shoot, cut
cut
and
and
shoot.
shoot. It used to be just an N in the middle,
Cut and
and
shoot.
then when the census in the '90s, we had over 1,000 people. We thought that was just classless, so we decided to get classy. We got ourselves an ampersand. So
Oh, it's
now it's
actually an
real.
ampersand.
It's
Well,
high class
to
now.
me, the greatest American city name was Truth or Consequences, New
New
Mexico.
Mexico. Yeah.
But now actually it's Cut and Shoot, Texas.
Yeah.
Tell me about Cut and Shoot.
Well, I mean, cut and shoot where I grew up had about 15 churches for 1,000 people. One of those places, kind of place that when you meet somebody for the first time, you don't ask them about their job, you don't ask them any of that stuff. You say, "Well, what church do you go to?" It's one of those kind of communities. It's outside of Conroe, Texas, which is about a town of about 25,000 people. So it's a rural community. When I grew up there, we didn't have a restaurant or nothing. We had a deer processing place, combination gas station. That was kind of the big place in town.
So they process the deer at the gas station?
Yeah, there was a gas station, and then in the same building, the same guy that ran the gas station also had a deer processing place, meat processing
So
place. So,
could one purchase venison chops
oh
and
yeah,
sausage and so on?
because a lot of times they take that stuff on a partnership. So when you like if you take a pig or a cow in, instead of paying to have it processed, the butcher will take a cut. You see.
That is identical to the part of Italy where I spent a lot of time. I spent a lot of time in Italy, but it's called Friuli Venezia Giulia,
Oh,
and
nice.
that's northeast. And the Romans settled there thousands of years ago and brought pork butchery to that part of Italy. So a lot of the prosciutto di San Daniele, Prague ham that we think of as being from Prague, is actually from Trieste, the capital of the region. And they have a tradition on the 29th of November. It's called the Porcitada, and who knew that this is where we would start our discussion, which is the ritual slaughtering of the pig, which is not a pretty thing, and my apologies to vegetarians, but this is part of traditional life. And it was done because the weather was considered proper in terms of the temperature. And the people who would do this proper slaughtering of the pig and humane um, would get part of the pig as their payment. And similarly, in other parts of Italy, where there are communal mills for olives or communal vats, cantinas to make wine, those cooperative people who bring in their grapes leave some wine for the person doing that. Similarly with the olive oil. So there's a wonderful collective sense to farming and hunting and food management and so on that goes back thousands of years and not attached to a gas station, to a petrol station, but nonetheless. Where in all of this did music enter your life?
Well, I grew up in, it's my grandfather was a missionary Baptist preacher, so we were always involved in the church. And early on, my father loves music. He loves it, and likes. As a little kid, my dad was he worked for an oil company in Texas. It's pretty cliche, but it's true. And he had to monitor a lot of pipeline crossings by construction crews and stuff like that. And he did the microwave communications and all that. So he was always on, kind of in his company truck driving around, and we would sit in the truck, and we would sing along with the country music station, and he'd teach me harmonies. So I learned how to sing harmony, bluegrass and country, Southern gospel harmony, in elementary school, and it's just sort of a natural thing. He had a little guitar he gave me. I started playing guitar, and next thing I knew, I was singing specials in church, and of course, I was in choir in elementary and in middle school, and so I sort of got into it that way. For me, the good thing about when you sing in church, especially in a missionary Baptist church, there's not a lot of applause because it's for the Lord. It's not for that singer. But at the end of the service, everybody would come up to you, no matter how bad you did, no matter how many words you forgot, or sang out of tune. They didn't care. They would just say, "Oh, Brother Mike, that was such a blessing. You just blessed my soul." And so you had this feeling like you were doing something besides just, making music. You kind of felt like you were helping people and blessing people and things like that. So it's kind of a great way to start for a young musician.
Well, I know that you are close friends with and have worked with Jamie Barton, who I interviewed. Listeners know I teach at New York University. I teach in the opera program,
Mm-hmm.
and I have guests come in and we talk about what they're doing. This is for the Italian department. And I had Jamie recently, and she and I spoke about her church upbringing in a tiny town in Georgia, whose name I forget, but really tiny, tiny. And how her
Georgia, Rome,
family,
Georgia, right? Was it
pardon me?
Rome? Wasn't it Rome, Georgia? She's from?
No, it's really tiny,
Oh, even
really.
smaller.
I mean, I forget that it didn't have a name really, but they lived in effect out in the country, and the church was the musical center of town. And she knew music and learned music from hearing and making harmonies with her family,
Yeah, yeah,
and which was a very different experience, for example, from mine growing up in Brooklyn and Manhattan and having all of these theaters and concert halls around it, having a
oh,
father who was a musician.
yeah.
But my father, who played trombone, loved music, loved vocal music, and liked to take his trombone and reproduce vocal sounds on the trombone so that he could do Ella Fitzgerald or Doris Day
Get out of here.
or Licia Albanese. He was able to somehow, through his trombone, communicate their sound. So he taught me about listening in terms of harmony and chord progressions. And but Sundays in New York City, and not only, we have radio that broadcast from the black churches of our city.
Mm-hmm.
And every half hour, they'd go to a different church for the services, and we would hear the choirs. And my favorite was one in Brooklyn called the Garden of Prayer,
Yeah.
where the choir was terrific and the preacher was terrific. And I grew up with that sound, and I've written about this a lot so people know that obviously opera for me is number one,
Yeah.
but they don't expect that gospel, African American gospel, would be
Yeah.
number two. And many of my black friends often call me up and ask me, who sang this, or what's your favorite version of How I Got Over, or who was better, Albertina Walker, Dorothy Norville, you name it. I just adore this. And the reason is, and this is what I want to get back to with you, Mike, is I find that in gospel singing and in opera, that yes, there are musical constructs, but there is an innate sincerity
Yeah.
and belief that goes with it. And those opera singers and those very few gospel singers who don't really genuinely believe and they're becoming performative, it shows right away.
Yeah.
And it's not
Yes.
very acceptable, at least from
Yeah.
my point of view. Um, where in your church singing did you connect to the, let's call it the belief system? And I mean specifically not about religion, but how you apply that to opera.
Yeah. I understand that. Yeah. I mean, when you were the thing that when I first got into, I couldn't read music when I got to college. Just like Jamie, everything was by ear, and I was a good musician, but not that kind of musician, right? And one of the things when I started studying opera and discovering opera, which I didn't know anything about opera to college. David Sundquist, my first voice teacher, taught me everything I needed to know to start out. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that I missed about singing in church or singing in a bluegrass festival or in a jam circle was that connection, that direct connection with the audience. Because the opera always felt so big and expansive and epic, and the closest audience member was 20, 30 feet away. And so what I missed was like looking out into the audience and connecting with that person in the front row. You're singing Beulah Land, this song about I'm kind of homesick for a country to which I've never been before, and it's about talking about someone who's so tired of life that they just want to go to heaven. And you see these old folks that have all kinds of afflictions and pain, and every day is tough, and you sing that for them, and you see them connecting, and you see their eyes start to water, and the tears, and then some tears kind of come into your eyes if you're not a stone cold. You start to have that empathetic, sympathetic reaction. And when I first started getting into opera, of course, this is in the '90s. There wasn't a lot of edgy new stuff or small, it wasn't happening. And so that's the thing that I miss so much, and that I found later as I was able to sort of more direct my own career path and sort of move in that direction. That's always what I wanted to get back to with opera. And so that's the thing that always kept bringing me back. Like, where does that emotional connection to the audience? Where's that thing where you open up your heart and just show them, this character's experience that's so wrapped up in your own, and has so much resonance with your own personal experience and their personal experience. And you get that group catharsis that can transcend any political, cultural difference in the world, because you get people from the back door. They're not expecting it, and they're sort of caught unaware, and the next thing you know, they're caught up in that emotion with you, and that wave of bringing people along with you, not the sort of gymnastics floor routine like 10-10-10 thing, or people treat opera like it's a sport, or like it's Dungeons and Dragons or baseball trading cards. I never have gotten into that part of it. For me, the part that just the pith of this art form is the incredible intensity of the unamplified voice communicating emotions to several thousand people at the same time, or 50 to 100 people at the same time. But that sort of that resonance that you get with your audience when they're there with you, like when Dead Man Walking or Glory Denied, when I'm sitting there at the end of the show, and you can the lights go down and you can hear everybody, crying and sniffling, and you touched them, you reached them, and you did something. And it's that sort of connection to sort of affecting change and really helping people that connects me back to my earlier faith. I'm a total opposite of where I was growing up. Now, people always say, I can tell that your grandfather was a preacher because you lost the evangelical, but you kept the evangelism. So I always feel like I'm preaching for opera.
I want listeners to know, and Michael, this is a fact, not my opinion, that Michael is one of the most arresting, riveting figures on the operatic stage. And if listeners outside of the United States don't know him all that well, it's in part because he's made most of his career in the United States, and I'll get to that in a moment. But what you are speaking about in terms of this emotional connection, this understanding and belief, and we're seeing movement here. Tell me what's going on.
I just realized
we're getting a house tour.
Out to die.
Okay.
I had everything set up but the power cord.
All right, then I'm going to talk.
Yeah.
And actually, for this circumstance, I have a list that I was going to do later. When I was saying that Michael is among the most American of opera singers, and I want to get into with Michael this concept of what is American opera, I made a list, I did some research of the cities where Michael has sung in the United States. San Diego, California, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Kansas City, Missouri, Central City, Colorado, Dallas, Texas, Fort Worth, Texas, Pensacola, Florida, Washington, D.C., New Orleans, Louisiana, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Eugene, Oregon, Omaha, Nebraska, Boston, Massachusetts, Baltimore, Maryland, Syracuse, New York, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Nashville, Tennessee, Wilmington, Delaware, Memphis, Tennessee, New York City, Detroit, Michigan, Madison, Wisconsin, Des Moines, Iowa, Shreveport, Louisiana, Louisville, Kentucky, Tacoma, Washington, Birmingham, Alabama, San Antonio, Texas, Charleston, South Carolina, Connecticut, though I don't know where, Duluth, Minnesota, Augusta, Georgia, and Atlanta, Georgia. Now, I didn't do that, Mike, while you did your traveling music, but because I want listeners from outside the US and maybe even in the US to understand opera in America is much more than the Met, San Francisco Opera,
Yes.
Chicago Lyric Opera, and Houston Grand Opera, and a few of the other very famous companies. We have more than 200 opera companies in the United States.
Yeah.
They are funded and they function entirely differently from companies in Germany and other countries. But opera is very, very entrenched. And
Yes.
there are certain states, Texas being one of them, Oklahoma another, Ohio another, for reasons I don't know, that have disproportionately produced a lot of great opera singers.
Yeah, it does.
And I think in the case of Oklahoma and Texas, it is the church tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I think in the case of Ohio, it is the ethnic historic tradition of many, many Germans, a lot of
Yep.
Italians, a fair amount of Jews, people who in their old countries loved opera and they brought opera to Ohio and built it early on.
Yeah.
So that you have small towns in Ohio with excellent opera companies. Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, has a wonderful opera school. We don't necessarily think of the state of Indiana and opera, but IU, as it's called by everyone, is wonderful. We have music conservatories all along the East Coast in the historic towns such as Baltimore and Philadelphia, New York, Boston. Yale has an excellent school of music. They're kind of everywhere.
Yeah.
And foreigners don't know that.
Yeah.
Foreigners think that Americans are either New Yorkers like me or Texans like you, and a few other stereotypes. But our country is, with all of its problems, and we definitely have them, is remarkably complex, remarkably diverse.
Yeah.
And Michael, you have taken certain roles to many different cities. We're going to talk about your most famous role later, but you've taken certain roles to many different cities. And I
Mm-hmm.
imagine that the reactions are different. Tell me about audience reactions in different cities in terms of their behavior, in terms of their even talking during the show, in terms of how they listen, how they give back.
Yeah.
What are American audiences like in different parts of the country?
Well, I mean, that's one of the gifts of my career, really. I mean, when I was younger, coming up, I mean, some of the places that you're listed, we're talking about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And I know, and like you said, everyone thinks that opera is New York, opera is San Francisco, opera is Chicago, and that's pretty much it. I mean, and that's kind of, I mean, as a young singer, I was possessed of that same notion. And it wasn't that I was so noble and then I decided to go out into the world, into the real flyover country and do all that. It wasn't that. That was just where I got hired. I didn't have the Chicago program. I didn't have the Met program. I didn't have Houston. I had, I did go to Santa Fe for one summer, but I didn't have that sort of pipeline career. But thank God that there was opera happening all over the country. Now I wasn't making a ton of money, but I was surviving. I wasn't covering, I wasn't doing character roles. I was doing lead roles all over the country in places like Shreveport and Pensacola and Opera on the James and Duluth Festival Opera, which doesn't even exist anymore. Mm-hmm. And what I found is that, we all have these preconceived notions about what people in flyover country, what the country folks
I want to
think about
define for
stuff.
people not from the States that flyover
Oh,
country, we have the East Coast and we have the West Coast. And flyover country is sort of the pejorative term for the rest of the United States, the
Yeah.
big landmass, if not the big population centers, but the big landmass of the country. People fly over going from New York to LA, from Washington to San Francisco, from Atlanta to Seattle. But the middle of the country is flyover. And we look
Yeah.
down and we see vast plains and lakes and mountains, but not too many people.
Right. And these folks, because I was working in these communities where austerity was kind of, especially if you're an opera company, you don't have a million, $10 million, $20 million budgets. You're doing, which is kind of great for these times, is that we were doing as much as we could with with a very little bit amount of money. And so what I've discovered is that the spirit of the community wasn't use opera. They were actually behind us the whole time. They were coming to see something they didn't get to see unless they watched it on television somewhere or on a broadcast or heard it on Saturday at the Met broadcast. So being able to bring something to them that they didn't think they had access to, and then you go into these communities, and because you're working with smaller forces, we don't have 4,000 seat houses. We may have 2,000 or 1,000 or 500. And so you can connect with people in a very much more intimate way. And the thing was, the compliment I always got that I loved the most was when people said, I forgot that I was watching an opera. Mm-hmm. I thought I was watching a television show or something, because they were close enough to be able to see everything. And so I always found the audiences, sometimes in the bigger cities, I felt like the audiences, they would clap and then sort of rush for the door to get to the parking lot first. But in these communities, these smaller communities, they were there for the opera. They came for the opera. They're not trying to get home. And being able to do things like we did in Des Moines, we did Soldier Songs and Glory Denied at an active military base, and gave command performances for veterans. That's the kind of connection that we wish we could have with some of the classic pieces, because those things seem so distant and so far away. But for these people, we were telling their truth, their own stories to them, and they had so much appreciation for it. You'd have people stand up and talk about how, seeing this opera changed the way that their family operates. Or guys that hadn't talked about the Vietnam War in 30 or 40, 50 years, finally talking about it for the first time in a talk back. It's those kind of connections that really, at first, when I first started out working in these smaller companies, I was frustrated, and I thought, well, I'm never going to be able to survive. I'm never going to be able to feed my family, etc. And then as I began to work, and as the market changed, I really understood, man, this is the heart and soul of our country. And I'm so lucky to have been able to build my career in the heartland of America. And I still worked on the coast. I still got to work in the big cities and stuff. But man, my heart and soul will always be with small town America, will always be in these regional markets. Because these people that come are so happy and so thankful. And especially when you tell a story that they're familiar with. I don't mean pandering, but I mean you're telling a story about some serious political or social or cultural issue. They have an immediate connection to that. And they're just so thankful and so appreciative of it. So it's been one of the blessings of my life. It used to be a hard time for me. I was like, I'm never going to, one of these days I want to sing at the Met. And now I don't care if I ever sing at the Met. Every experience that I've had the experiences in my career already where I could say, you know what, I've done what I need to do. And if I never sing again, I helped this lady. I helped this young man overcome his problems with being an ex-prisoner and being treated like a second-class citizen. I've talked to these veterans. I've talked to Colonel Thompson's daughter. She's now a good friend of mine, and I carry a talisman around with me. That's his, that she gave to me. I have those experiences, so I don't need to, I don't need to go and have the big accolades or all that stuff. The accolades that I care about come from people telling me how I changed their life or how I touched them, and that's good enough for me.
Listeners know that a couple of weeks ago I had another Texan on, the mezzo-soprano Sasha Cook. And one of the things that we discussed was the fact that many living composers build operas and roles on Sasha. They compose with her gifts in mind. And you similarly in the male division are one of the American singers who've had the most new operas.
Yeah.
And you're sort of the go-to guy for that, at least by American composers so far. I
Right.
want other composers to find you. But you, I began this discussion by using one of the adjectives American.
Yeah.
And it's such a fraught word because we are
Mm-hmm.
330 million people. There are stereotypes. There are outrageous people in government who unfortunately come to represent the nation, whether most of us feel they do or they don't. And therefore, our image in the international world, and also, frankly, through film, through television, through the arts, through journalism, through everything we do, through McDonald's, is that we eat well, we're all obese. We don't eat well, we're all obese. We eat massive portions of cattle and deer at a gas station. We we're everything that is a little part of the American landscape, but hardly the great picture. And many of the operas that I've seen you in, I've been fortunate to see you in quite a few, are American people. And you are asked to play that. And sometimes they're good guys, and sometimes they're bad guys, and sometimes they are people who have proudly served their country and not necessarily gotten the kind of credit or care or love or acknowledgement that they should. So
Yeah.
the question is, in your years of traveling the country and meeting Americans and working with them,
Mm-hmm.
have you consciously or unconsciously absorbed, subconsciously absorbed the Americanness, the great diversity of our nation?
Yeah. I cannot see how I couldn't. You know, I can't. I just. I mean, everybody I meet, I feel like a sponge. I love storytellers. I love listening to stories. You know, that's why I had a podcast back in 2010. I got the video series, the Dallas Opera Network, and that's because at the core of what we do is not music. The core of what we do is storytelling and shared empathy. And so when you're going around the country and you're having these emotional experiences with people, and then they come and they tell you how that affected them, you can't help but absorb some of that, and you take that with you wherever you go. I had a woman come up to me after Dead Man Walking in Tulsa, and she said that, she didn't come up to me. It was on social media on a fan page thing. And you get used to the hardest thing was one of the hardest things for me as this humble Texas boy was taking compliments. People always wanted to say, tell you they want to reflect back what you gave them, and they wanted to make sure that you know how much they appreciated it. And that's really hard for a person that comes from my background. We're never supposed to be too proud. But I learned how to say thank you. I learned how to accept that. And a woman, she wrote this message, and it's the same stuff you sort of hear over and over again. Oh, it's so beautiful, and then the acting was powerful, and all this stuff. And then she had a paragraph. She said, "My daughter was killed 7 years ago, and you changed the way I think about the man who murdered my daughter." Well, okay. Like that's pretty. I mean, that's one of those moments I was talking about where you can't help but absorb that. You can't help but absorb that. And that experience and that story and just talking, going back and forth with her on private message. Every time I walk on stage, she's there with me. That experience, her words are with me. When Sister Helen came up to me and hugged my neck, and she's like, oh, Sister Helen, she's rock and roll doing, hey, boy, let me see them tattoos. And then she goes up and she hugs me around the neck, and she gets right in my ear and she says, "Mike, I know this is hard. I know playing this guy hurts. I know it. But it's worth it because you're telling the stories of these 300 men that nobody cares about and that nobody listens to and that nobody sees. And you're making sure they are seen." Okay, have a great show.
So,
Those
Michael,
things go with you.
I'm holding on to the opera Dead Man Walking for a bit later in our discussion.
Yeah, sure. But that's just an example of that.
Because obviously, I want to talk about it. But
yeah, sure.
There are many people who associate you so much with the role of Joseph Desrochers that I
Mm-hmm.
want them to know that you have a vast repertory and do all kinds of other things.
Oh, yeah.
I want to ask you more about Glory Denied.
Oh, lovely
Tell
piece.
us that story and that character.
Well, the story of Glory Denied is based on a book by the same title. It's the true story of the longest held POW, a prisoner of war, in American history. He was held for 9 years in a Vietnamese prison camp. And his plane crashed. His back was broken. For the first 4 months, he was held in a box that was 2 by 2 by 5 with a broken back while it healed. And then for the next 5 years, he was kept in solitary confinement. And he was so, he's my size. He was 98 pounds by the time he was ever allowed to see another American. And they thought that they were playing a joke on him by putting a corpse in the cell with him. And then he moved and they all panicked because they realized that's where they were going. Now, the entire time he was in this prison camp, the only thing that was keeping him going was this vision of his perfect family back at home, his perfect wife, his 3 daughters, an unborn son. But he knew it was his son. We didn't have technology back then, but he could tell it was his son. And in his mind, he's building this dream house for his family that he can't wait to get back to, especially his young son. Well, not like 6 months after he was captured, his wife moved those 3 daughters and now born son in with another man and had him raise these kids as his own and totally erased his role as father and everything. And then when the military came and so we had these tapes, she realized that if she admitted that was him and that he was alive, that those army checks and her whole situation would stop. And so she fought from the beginning to make sure that nobody knew that he was in prison camp. And so the bracelets that went out and all those things, he didn't get one of those because they had them recalled because she said, if you release his name to the press, there'll be hell to pay. So when he's coming back from Vietnam, he got liberated. He's on the plane. And everybody has boxes of letters and pictures and stuff. He has nothing. I mean, not even a Dear John letter. Mm-hmm. So when he lands, she meets him there with his parents, no kids, and has to come clean about the whole situation. Mm-hmm. And of course, it just tears him apart. He falls to pieces, grabs a bottle of scotch, goes to the hospital room and drinks for like 2 days and comes out and says, I want to try to make this work. They try to get back together. Of course it doesn't work. He's been gone for 9 years. His son is 9 years old. Mm. He gets baptized at 9 because, of course, he couldn't get baptized before. So he falls into addiction. He falls into alcoholism. He sort of isolates himself from his family, so much so that when he died in like 2001, I think, he died alone in the Florida Keys, estranged from his family. His daughters actually came down to the dock to try to go to the service, and they were turned away because he was said, you can't come. And so the man, we have all these stories about John McCain or Unbreakable, all these things about these hero stories, but this is the more typical story of what happens to people in the theater of war when they come back. They come back forever changed, and sometimes, especially given at a time we didn't understand what PTSD was, they come back to a place that they're sick and they have no place to go. And they end up sort of making their families sick in the process because there's just no way, there was no cure for it back then. There was no therapies. They didn't know what they were doing. They would just dope them up or people would self-medicate and whatever. So this story is so powerful. It's set with 4 characters, old Alice, young Alice, old Thompson, young Thompson. And it's essentially about their relationship and about how this MacGuffin of the Vietnam War kept putting pressure until finally it popped and things went crazy. But it's one of the most moving stories I've ever told. And, you just can't, the pathos to see this man totally ground down by the cruelest engines of society over and over again. And then just sort of, he just dissipates. He dies alone in the Florida Keys from a stroke and he's just gone. And it's just devastating. And you tell these stories and there's veterans in the audience. I had a young man, a stand-up, or young man, he was probably younger than me, but he stood up and was talking about how his wife was a guard at Guantanamo Bay just after the scandal broke. And when she came back to the family, everything was crosswired. She just wasn't the same woman. She sort of pulled back from her child, her son, who never understood that. He began to resent her. So we're talking about 15 years, 16 years, the kid's a teenager, and they have never had a good relationship. Well, that night it was daddy-son night. So he and his son went to see this opera in Nashville, Tennessee. Sorry. And he stands up after the show and gives his testimony. That's what we call it in the Baptist church, And he said, my son reached over, and he tells us a story about how everything happens. And he goes, my son's sitting here next to me, and his son's just sitting there with his head in his hands, you know. And he says, he reached over and grabbed my leg after the show, and he said, I think I understand Mom now. I think I understand Mama now. And 2 weeks later, this man wrote us all in the cast and thanked us for the show, because he said his relationship with his wife and his son and everything has completely changed. The son goes in and says, I love you, Mom. And something about that show, something about Alice's experience, something about Colonel Thompson's experience touched this 16-year-old kid in such a way that it helped him. I'm not saying we repaired the kid. The kid had to do it on his own. The family had to do that work. But the opera was a catalyst for the change in that family. That's the kind of work I love to do more than anything in the world. Because no matter what you're getting paid, no matter what you feel like you're doing something good. You feel like you're helping people. And the word opera means work, right? Mm-hmm. Well, I think it should do work. It should do the work, do work in the communities that it's presented, and it should serve those communities. And that piece is one of them that does it every time. I've never done it that I haven't had that kind of response from somebody.
So I have a very specific question regarding this opera, and the composer is Tom Cipulo, who is the
Tom Cipulo, yeah.
Cipulo. But you can apply it to all, but I'm asking specifically about this. You correctly were speaking about storytelling, which happens on many levels in opera and music and words and theater, in production design and acting and all of that. But I wonder whether the audiences who see a work like this are connecting primarily through the words and the acting, and maybe less so in the music, not because of the quality of the music, but because they're not accustomed to storytelling through music.
Yeah.
And do you adapt your performance? Do you, when you speak with audiences, talk about the musical elements?
Well, I mean, the thing about Tom's music is it's very evocative, It's not simple music by any means, but he has these moments
music,
of...
But I'm just wondering whether people get that.
Yeah, I think they do, especially people in the pit, but the audience, yeah. Especially Glory Denied. Glory Denied had its moments of like just ultimate chaos, and you can't really find that it's lost. But it reflects the nature of Colonel Thompson's mental space. And Tom's other pieces, when he's not dealing with characters like that, they don't have that sort of texture. But Thompson always has that. It's like just bees in his head, And then whenever he thinks about his perfect wife and he thinks about his perfect family that doesn't exist, but anyway, things calm down and they get lyrical and beautiful and almost heartbreaking. Like My Darling Jim, the young Alice's big aria, she's a figment of his imagination. Young Alice doesn't really exist. It's this idealized version of his wife. When he teases this thing all the way, it's basically a setting of a letter that Alice had written. The interesting thing about this show is that every word in the show was either said by Colonel Thompson or about Colonel Thompson by a real person, with a few exceptions. And so this letter is teased throughout whenever he starts to go mad or starts to get crazy or out of himself, you hear this theme come in and it sort of calms him down. And through the whole show until there's actually two endings. We do the ending where you end with that aria. It's finally him at peace. He finally gets to hear the entire beautiful, lyrical, traditional aria, and it sort of like lets him go, and so I think they get it, especially, they don't get it when, they tend to sort of struggle with the more chaotic parts, but I think that's what you're supposed to. It's supposed to be hard to understand because he was, in those moments, he was not understanding anything. So you sort of bring the audience along in that confusion, and then you give them a break from it with some nice, beautiful lyricism, which Tom does so well.
I have had 2 or maybe 3 very distinct experiences with opera and the military. And they're very different, all 3, but very telling about the role of military people in our society. Again, very fraught right now with how people in military see their roles in our society, as whether they work for the commander in chief, whether they represent the best values of the American people, all of that. We don't have to get into that. But when I meet military people, that is a very interesting element because there's a goodness about them that is immediately palpable.
Yeah.
And one experience was a number of years ago, the West Point Academy, which is north of New York City, is really the elite training center for the Army, and the cadets are there. And many of the men and women who come out of there go on to great leadership roles in the United States and in NATO and elsewhere. And a number of years ago, I was asked to teach a symposium to any cadet who was interested about opera. And at that time, the Metropolitan Opera was doing in repertory Così fan tutte by Mozart and Verdi's Aida.
Yeah.
And to me, I decided that they were going to be most interested in Aida because it's a story of two countries at war, Egypt and Ethiopia, in ancient times, and how the princess of Egypt loves the commander of the Egyptian army, Radames. The princess is Amneris. And Aida is the Ethiopian princess taken as slave in Egypt. And she, of course, falls in love with Radames and he with her. So, what it becomes, among many things, is a question of public responsibility versus private passion and desire. And where do you place your priority? Is it in your service? Is it in your heart? Is it what you know to be right? And I didn't offer answers to them. And what I found very interesting and instructive for me was that for the cadets, that was sort of a basic done deal that it's
Mm-hmm.
public service. And that comes first. And there was no question. I expected more of a debate. And these young people, exceedingly polite, but also were willing to engage in debate. And I was a little taken aback and left without much to talk about, right?
Well,
Because
okay.
they just put me right in my place. I spoke about the history of the musicology and they loved it. We went
Yeah.
to see it at the Met. And then I figured, okay, a nice little romantic comedy with a lot of psychology, Così fan tutte. That one would be interesting because that's about relations between men and women and how we don't always understand one another and certain assumptions about class and all of that that's part of that opera. But that is the opera that completely got them turned around upside down and inside out. And the
Really?
reason was not just the emotionalism, but the fact that at the beginning of the opera, the two young men pretend that they have to go off to war, and the women are upset. And to these young people, that was a graphic depiction of the families left behind,
Mm.
and that they didn't quite see the humor.
Yeah.
And the whole premise of the opera, that the boys come back disguised and test the fidelity of their girlfriends, that was secondary
Yeah.
to the genuine grief and what the women were feeling. So the deception that is revealed to them was completely immoral.
Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
got into such a deep discussion about morality and families, not about religion, not about politics, but morality in the sense of doing the right thing for your families
Yeah.
and honesty. And, God bless opera, that where we least expected that Così fan tutte could harvest that kind of sophisticated and complex and honest discussion was so instructive for me. So that was number one. Number two, more recently, I was invited to Fairbanks, Alaska, where I'd never been. It's a very beautiful place. And they were doing a production of La Boheme, for which the entire budget production of Fairbanks Opera, which is a good established company, was $1,800.
Mm-hmm.
And they went to Walmart and they bought wood and they built the sets and they wore clothing that they bought in Walmart. And it was
Yeah.
completely plausible for Marcello and Musetta and Rodolfo and Mimi. And it was a very beautiful production. And I helped them on that. And then I did lectures and Fred Plotkin stuff. And they told me that their production the next year was going to be Carmen. And they didn't quite know what to do with that. And one of the largest military bases in the United States is just outside of Fairbanks.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting in some way to engage the military? Again, not to challenge them. This is a different, these are station troops. They were not the elite of West Point. But to see Don Jose and his conflict, his missing his mother, his attraction to this woman, uh, I said, do not make it an Alaska native playing Carmen as a dark woman. That's too stereotypical.
Yeah.
But two people, and
Yeah.
whoever the best singer you get is, that's who you should use. And then Escamillo being a toreador is very remote. Seville is very remote from Fairbanks, Alaska, in every way. But apparently, they made the military setting more palpable in the
Hmm.
production, and they invited military families, and they had talkbacks after about the mother back home and Don Jose's mother and the boredom of the troops, because a lot of times they sit around and idle, which is why some of them in the opera get in trouble with these women who work in the tobacco
Yeah.
factory, and all the stereotypes. But underlining the stereotypes is the reality of military life. And La Fille du Régiment is almost a parody about the daughter of the regiment, about military life. But in that too, there's nostalgia, there's pecking order, there's loneliness, and all of that. But so those are the two things. But it brings to mind that I have a really wonderful friend in Germany. I met him in 2018 on an airplane because I overheard him talking about opera. So, I immediately jump out of my seat, even though we're landing.
What? Hey, 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 hey! Come on, come on! Like, one of us, one of us.
And he's an American, and I'm respecting his privacy, but he has served our country magnificently for a long time, as has his wife, who
Hmm.
is also a wonderful person I've come to know. And they genuinely love opera. And often when I think about service, when I think about American characters and the best of our nation, I think of them and many people that they've been in contact with and whom they've served. And I'm not making myself pro military, anti military, but I think that we understand on one level what they do for American lives and in the world.
Hmm.
Many of them are misunderstood because of a few bad apples
Yeah.
who do terrible things, but they're the distinct minority, as in every profession. And but I recognize in this gentleman the degree to which the opera stories and the opera music deeply touch his life. He's a West Pointer. Um, and I just love sharing with him and his wife on all kinds of topics. And even though we've only seen each other a couple of times, these modern communications enable us to be in touch. And
Yeah.
they tell me a lot of what's good about our country. And I mention all of this, Michael, because you remind me of him.
Oh.
And you're very different kinds of people, believe me, but you are at the core, you're the same person.
Hmm.
And I feel that from him, and I feel that from you, and I feel that in your opera performances. So, well, actually, let's deal with one other character before we get to the big famous one. You once played Wozzeck. Is
Yeah.
that correct?
Yes. Oh
So
man.
Wozzeck is a soldier. He's a grunt soldier. He is
Yeah.
bedraggled. Was it in Omaha or Des Moines? I forget
Des
where.
Moines, Des
Des
Moines,
Moines,
Iowa.
okay, in
Yeah.
Iowa. And talk about how you built that character, who is a prototypical oppressed soldier who
Yeah.
has no advantages and has a terrible life. In a way, it connects to Glory Denied, I would think. Am I
Yeah.
correct on that?
Yeah. I mean, it's when I've done three, four now, five. Like I'm losing count. So many operas about with military themes, and at the core of Vodsek, yeah, I mean the military is kind of it's the MacGuffin. It's one of the things that are kind of pushing out, but you know, you do get the sense, especially as an American, that our military is staffed primarily by people from a very specific economic class, and you when you're telling Wozzeck's story, that sort of thing is really comes to the fore, and you see how this guy. And I don't even, when I look at it, it has to do with the military, but it has to do with sort of the oppressive nature of authoritarian society or society in general, or the inability for people to understand or to have any compassion for people with mental health issues. He was schizophrenic, bipolar. He was bipolar, and so we would understand Wozzeck today. We'd say, "Hey, Wozzeck, go get some therapy or here's some medicine." He didn't have any of that back then. So this guy that didn't fit into society, society decided to just squish him and press him and really, growing up in the country, we have chickens, right? And you have a whole bunch of chickens in a chicken pen, and you get one chicken with a little bit a wrong colored feather or a little bit of a blood spot, and the other chickens will peck that spot until they kill that bird. And that's what that thing kept coming back to me during Wozzeck. He was just so different that everybody else, even everybody just basically abandoned him to his own devices, and he was so beset with this mental health issue that he couldn't see clearly. And so those themes are, building that character, and I felt so, a lot of times in my life I felt like I was kind of being stepped on, kind of being pushed down. Especially with respect to the opera business. I'm not a typical opera singer. People never believe me when I tell them that I'm in the opera world. I'm like, yes, I'm an opera singer. And they're like, yeah, right. And when you don't fit, you often feel like the whole world's against you. And I could feel those feelings playing Wozzeck, and just the despair, that he was going through. I've talked about this before, so I'm not breaking any news here. In 2009, I tried to kill myself. And so I'm a suicide survivor. And that despair, whenever you get to that point in your life where you just decide you have so much despair that living one more second is just too much to even contemplate. So might as well just... That's something I really related to with Wozzeck. And I was also, at the same time, it was terrible, Fred, because, Pete, man, best dog in the whole world. And, he had cancer and was dying that whole time. He was just slowly dying. And man, I had that dog through some of the hardest times in my career. Some of the just deep, dark midnights of my soul. And he was always there. He was the most empathetic creature I could ever possibly imagine. He was just always, if I ever did this, he would be right up here against me, putting his head on my thing. "Oh, what's going on, Dad? How you doing?" And there were some times when I had nobody else in the world but that dog. I was homeless, didn't have a place. Not like living on the street, but didn't have a home, living out of a pickup truck, had a bed in the back, for me and Pete. Doing Wozzeck and having that character so immersed in despair, and then to have this despair that's coming. I can see him getting sicker every day and every day. And Pete actually passed away the night before my last performance of Wozzeck in Des Moines. Yeah. And there's that moment when he's in the tavern, and there's that falsetto sort of like wail. And that night, the sound that came out of me was all of that grief. And not just the grief for Pete that I just lost my, he just basically said, I've gotten you through all these other hard times. This last one's on your own. The hardest role you've ever had to do in your life. You can do it. You don't need me. That all of those emotions were coming through me the entire time. And I'm definitely one of those performers. People sort of say like, "Oh, you're like Daniel Day-Lewis or a method actor," and maybe that's appropriate. I never studied acting. I just sort of learned by doing. But that day, I was just a channel. It was so. We are fortunate to get to play other people, because we get to do things on stage that if you did them out in the streets, you get arrested for. And we have this most safe space to have these incredibly dramatic and these emotional reactions that are just unacceptable to have in the world. So we as performers get to have them. And in so doing, the audience there, if they're with us and we have them, they're having it too. They're just not doing it, but they're having it too. And that's what the predominant feeling I had during that entire show. I mean, it was in a place I loved too, Des Moines Metro Opera. Look, they even got their cup right here, you know. Uh, I love that company, and they do amazing things. My director, Christine McIntyre, is probably one of the most profound
Mhm.
influences on my life from an acting standpoint. So, yeah, hold on one second. The most profound influences on my career as far as acting and communicating and storytelling. And so it's like all of those things were coming to a fore. Some of the most profound relationships I've ever created with other singers, I created in the place that we lived there in the Hamilton House with John Moore and Taylor Staton, Jan LeClaire and Ben LeClaire, all these folks that we went through the trenches together. You know, all those memories wrapped up in one show. And
Yeah.
it's like the last thing I did there. It's just,
So
it's
now
remarkable.
I want to get to the role that you are so famous for
Yeah.
that I sometimes, on your behalf, because I love you, worry about your being so identified with the role that people don't know the person I know.
Right.
And
Yeah.
because you do it so masterfully, and he is, I don't want to apply an adjective. Let's just use a simple word, bad. He's not a great person.
Way bad. He even
And,
says that in the show. I'm bad, sister. Way
I
bad.
mean, we could say evil, but different words have different connotations. And I
Yeah.
think if I simply say bad,
Yeah.
listeners get the idea. Um, Many of you listeners may have seen a film with Susan Sarandon and Sean Penn called Dead Man Walking, which is based on a book by sister, a nun, Helen Perjohn, set in Louisiana at Angola prison. Is that correct? I
Yes.
think, yeah. Angola is a notorious prison. It's one of the, frankly, worst in the United States, and
It used to be a
it
plantation.
used to be in plantation. The
They just changed the name, but the practices
Yeah,
are still the
the
same.
conditions are awful there, and
Yeah.
it's notorious for many reasons. And uh, I'm not now going to get into an issue of the American prison system and prison reform, but it's one of the many issues that can be raised in talking about that opera. It was set to music by Jake Heggie, a marvelous American composer who
Mm.
I admire greatly. You did his opera Great Scott, which was a comedy, Joyce DiDonato, Eileen Perez, Anthony Roth Costanzo, a wonderful cast in Dallas, which I came to see. Um, Three Decembers is by Jake Heggie as well, I believe.
Also
And
done that.
so you've done works of Jake Hagee's,
Yeah.
and he's marvelous, and I want him on my show sometime. The opera premiered in San Francisco
Mm.
and starred Susan Graham, I believe, as Helen Perjohn,
Yeah.
and Frederica von Stade as the mother of Joseph de Rocher, who sounds like a French nobleman, but he's anything but.
Oh, it's Des Rocher. You know, if you're doing it down
De
there,
Rocher, de
Des
Rocher,
Rocher.
he's Louisiana. Would you, rather than me characterize Joseph, tell us about Joseph, which is the role that you memorably play?
You know, it's funny. I talk about this guy a lot. You know, and and I'm always trying to find a way to distill who he is. And this is a guy. See, I come from the same area of the country as he does. I mean, I'm a few hours away from the bayou, and I got Cajuns in my family. Cajun is French Arcadian sort of heritage that grew up in like Louisiana, right? This guy is like, you know, what they call poor white trash, you know, and I grew up sort of what people would call poor white trash. I grew up in a trailer too. The difference is that, you know, my grandfather was a preacher, therefore sort of well read. My mother read all the time. Education was important to my family, and I was able to go to college, and I was able to learn how to express myself in ways that weren't violent. You know, through my words, and sometimes my words can be aggressive, but I don't hit anybody. You know, but I grew up with a lot of guys that you could see them having an emotion or an idea that they wanted to express, but they lacked the ability to do so verbally. And so that ultimate frustration that these guys had all often manifested itself in violence and addiction and all these negative things, all these bad habits and bad. Well, Joseph de Rocher he's just a tornado of all those things. You know, he had dyslexia. You know, he had a hard time reading and understanding things. So that was another layer that made it difficult for him. He had a stepdad that used to beat the hell out of him. So then he understood at a very young age that violence was the solution. You know, that was always the solution to any problem. Whatever the question was, you just hit it. You know, and so this guy went through this, and he was just this forever little boy that never really understood how to express himself in a healthy way, and that ultimately led to him expressing his rage and anger through sexual assault and murder. And while, you know, we all understand that we're all very high-minded progressive people, it's when you're telling this story to sort of middle America, there's a different reaction to that thing. And that's sort of the genius of the way that Terrence and Jake set the character up and everything, is that you could be on the right or the left or for the death penalty or against the death penalty, watch this show and finish the show and still maintain your same opinion. If I did my job, I'll make Joseph so vile, so monstrous, because there's always, when you're telling a monster story, there's two ways to tell the story. You're either a human that becomes a monster or a monster that becomes a human. And Jake is, of course, the latter. I mean, Joseph de Rocher is no, not Jake. He's an angel. He's an angel. He's just an angel that became an angel. But Joseph starts out, you see him in the very first scene, the worst thing, his worst act. We see the thing that will define him for the rest of his life. You know, we define everybody by the worst thing they ever did, and that's what we see so there's no mental energy wasted on whether he's guilty or not. The whole point of the rest of the show is to get him to come to terms with the man that he is, with the actions that he's taken, with the lives that he's ended and the pain that he's caused, not only in his family and the family of the victims, but in his own family. So this guy, I mean, this is the guy that he goes through a transition that we want everybody to go through that's in that situation. We want everybody who's done something like that to look at the families and say, I'm sorry I took your kids from you. I'm sorry. And I hope that this gives you some relief. We want that. I think that is the journey that we want everybody to go on. Whether it's, you know, we've all transgressed. We've all done bad things. And it's important to take ownership for them and apologize and make amends and all that stuff. And it's real easy to do that for somebody who's, you know, borrowed your lawnmower for too long. But there's no distinction there with forgiveness. You have to be able to, it's easy to forgive the petty criminal, but it's hard to forgive the murderer and the rapist. So how much do you actually believe in forgiveness, right? And so that's the whole crux of that show. And so with that character, I mean, it's true. People often conflate me with that character. I've had people look me up because of some argument about some opera or something, and they were from another country, and they saw the tattoos, especially with the one with the swastika in my chest, you know, and they go, well, look at this guy. He's like a crazy criminal monster. They don't realize that it's not me. I'm not that guy, everybody. I'm the nice guy.
But you're so effective at making that happen. You know, just a little question before we get back to the big themes that I've always wanted to ask you, I never thought to. Are the tattoos identical on you from production to production to production?
No.
Or does production have its own set of tattoos?
Ruth Mitchell down in Tulsa has a stamp that's stamp collection of things. Literally, you just put these plastic things on, they roll them on, done. But I've had every different kind of tattoo you could possibly imagine. Every kind of application, from the Hollywood application, the people drawing stuff on with a pen, you know, pen and ink, or the stamps. You know, it's always
what I mean
different.
Is not how they're applied, but the subject matter.
They're all different.
Always
different. Yeah, sometimes there's naked ladies, sometimes there's iron eagles and iron crosses and stuff. It's just depending on what they're...
Is that up to the director of the production that you're working on?
It's usually, I mean, the director sort of, it's usually the makeup artist, and usually and the makeup artist and I have a discussion because tattoos, when in prison and stuff, they mean things, and the tattoos that we see today don't look anything like tattoos did back in the 80s. I mean, you'll see some retro stuff, but I would show up and sometimes they'd have this tribal stuff, or they'd have things that were very modern, very 1990s, very 2000s, very today, and it just takes you right out of the time period. And for all my criticism of what I call Renaissance fair opera, uh, sometimes it's important if you're putting something in a period, you can really take people out of it if there's something missing. Like for instance, with the tattoos and Dead Man Walking, or in Glory Denied, if you got the wrong bars or the wrong insignias, they let you know in a hurry, boy, and it takes them right out of the moment.
Well, actually, because I, not just when I watch you, but in all operas, I use binoculars and I look very closely at every costume detail, makeup, wigs. Are they wearing a microphone as they should
Yeah.
not be? And in the case of a role like yours, tattoos, because to me, what tattoos are on Joseph's body would tell me a lot about the character.
Mm-hmm.
And in the creation by you, by Jake Hagee, by Gene Shear, I believe is the librettist, by the directors and everyone else involved, the makeup people, that tells a specific story. So if you
Mm-hmm.
had Mozart here, that would mean a very different thing
Live,
from
laugh,
having an
love.
eagle.
Oh no! And the thing about the tattoos is that often, when you think about when I look at the guys that got tattoos, even when I was a teenager, which would have been the '90s, but the guys that I knew that were older, they just went into the tattoo shop and that one. It wasn't like, well, I thought about it for about a month, and then I had a consultation with my spiritual advisor, and then we decided that I would go with a dove with a alligator head. We they didn't do that back then. They were like, I like this one. This is a Tasmanian devil. It's great. You know. So it's he's just not that guy. He's not. It's not that he's not a thinker. It's just he thinks about different things.
Yeah. So I'm not a Catholic, but I grew up with Catholics. I joined them in many things and I learned from them. And one of the things that I learned is that there is a large proportion of the Catholic population, and Louisiana, compared to most of the South, is much more Catholic
Yeah.
for various historical reasons. And they have a belief in forgiveness. They believe in the preservation of life and not the taking of life.
Yeah.
And that's murder, but that is also capital punishment.
Mm-hmm.
And in Italy, where I've spent a great deal of time, it is one of the countries that is most profoundly against capital punishment
Mm-hmm.
and has used its moral force in the world, in addition to having the Catholic Church and the Pope there. And I remember that there was a young woman in Indiana named Paula Cooper who was on death row. She had murdered someone as a teenager out of frustration and mental illness. And again, not forgiving her for the murder. I'm not, at least, for the murder. But she was going to be put to death. She was African American. And I remember that Pope John Paul II actively interceded, even though he was very ill and had Parkinson's and so on. But to him, the killing of this young woman in Indiana, far, far away from where he was, touched him very deeply. And the other main character in the opera is Sister Helen Perjohn, who is a real figure. Thankfully, she's still with us. And the great moral force behind the opera. And one of the many things I love in this opera and in her story is that as a Catholic, as a nun, she believes in the preservation of life and is against the death penalty until she meets the families of the young people who were killed by Joseph de Rocher. And we see her growth. And then her challenge is to become your spiritual advisor
Mm-hmm.
and work you through the experience with, frankly, the inevitable outcome that you're going to be put to death,
Yeah.
which in productions I've seen with you has been depicted on the stage.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in the depiction of that, audiences ask themselves again what that's about. Listeners outside the country may not know that there was someone, I believe his name was Ted Bundy, who lived in
Yeah.
Florida and was a serial killer. And he was handsome and charismatic in ways that people thought, well, let's give him a pass because he's attractive, which was just insane. But other people felt that they wanted to participate in his being put to death. And at the moment in northern Florida, when he was seated in the electric chair, thousands of Floridians turned off their lights and unplugged their devices so that more electricity would be available to go to kill that man.
Yeah.
And
That sounds
under
right, Fred. It sounds accurate.
underlying all of this is the fact that, and we're not here right now to talk about pro or against death penalty,
Mm-hmm.
but the way that we as a society and we as a world experience death caused by others, and whether in supporting death penalty, whether we are participating in the death of another. I'm not asking you to answer that, but
Yeah.
I'm saying that that is one of the many points raised in the opera. Would you've worked with several great Sister Helens.
Yeah.
Would you talk about some of them and how your role changes, their role changes with each interpretation?
Yeah. Well, I've done I've done it with a lot of folks, and it's been interesting to watch each Sister Helen sort of come to a different version of her, you know, and to watch actually, it's a big bite for anyone to do. I mean, she doesn't leave the stage the entire night. It's Dead Man Walking, which is technically the title character would be me, but it's not. It's about Sister Helen because it's about her journey, and she gets to take Joseph along with him, and they both go through a tremendous amount of changes. But it's about her journey because that story is not over yet. She's still doing that stuff today. She's I think 13 now, or 14, 15 guys she's taken down to death row. And like with Jenny Rivera, for instance, I did it with her 3 times in a row. And to watch her grow through that entire experience, and then for me to be able to change my reactions and change and hone in on different aspects of the character, or the different things that my character would say, would impulses that would give her, that would cause her to react in a certain way organically. Those things were incredible. I mean, I've done them with Jenny. I did it with Joyce Donato and the Teatro Royal in Spain, which
And
was
in
just
London?
and in London, yeah, with the BBC, and that was incredible because she'd done it before, and it was years ago, but like she was coming back to the role after having sat dormant for a while, and I'd been sort of in the mix, doing it and doing it and doing it, and just seeing the perspective that she brought to it, and Joyce is like, I tell you, man, I didn't know Joyce too well before I worked with her there, I didn't. I didn't run in those circles, but I was familiar with her public persona and her PR, and I thought, it's a little too good to be true. No one's that sweet and nice. It ain't. That's how she is. It's 100% how she is. I mean, she actually goes out and she helps produce opera at Sing Sing Prison right now, using the production of opera itself to help rehabilitate people. So when you have somebody on stage with you that's doing that kind of stuff, you understand that they're not there. They're not there for the praise. They're not there for the, oh, look how great I am. You get those real moments, those real things. Or when I stared into Susan Graham's eyes when she was playing my mother, it's these moments of just absolute devastating beauty between these two folks. I mean, I got to, like, one of the hardest times is when you just only get to do it with a person one time. Like I did it with Daniela Mack in Madison, and she was outstanding. I still regret that I've never had a chance to do it with her again, because talking with Daniela, I realized we're going, we're just jumping into rehearsal, we're going, and she's this is not her repertoire. It's not something she normally did.
I think of her for Rossini.
That's it. And that's
Yeah.
a different bearing. My wife does Rossini a lot, and I understand I've done tons of Barbara Sevilles and stuff, and it's a different kind of way to connect with a character. And this became all too real, all very, and I could see it just like almost paralyzing her because it was afraid. It wasn't fear. It was just like so much coming into her at once. And it's one of those moments you get into production week and you're kind of waiting for that moment when everything falls away and there's just this, just this 2 moments and there's nothing in between you. And I think that it was the dress rehearsal. All of a sudden, like we both went boom. And then afterwards, you're crying. You can't help it because you've just connected in this way. That's just unbelievable. Kristen Chavez, my first, one in Tulsa. Oh, I mean, do you know Kristen?
Slightly.
She is another one of those women that's just nothing but love and light and just beauty, right? And just this inner light, like Joyce, this comes out of her. And it was both of our maiden voyage on that one, and so we were both going through this stuff together, and it just feels like you create a bond with these folks when you do stuff like that. That's unlike anything else. I've done a lot of bohems, I've done a lot of those things, Toscas, and you always move people and stuff like that. But when you're standing out there with another person like Joyce or Jenny or Kristen or Daniela or Elise Quayada, and you're talking to the people that you've affected together. That's kind of one of the reasons why I sort of feel like I relate to some of these veteran stories that we go through. It's a bit like going to war. I know it's not the same, but it's a matter of scale. You are really engaging in a sort of emotional battle together. And so each one of them has shown me a different aspect of Sister Helen. And I'm never not surprised. I'm always surprised. There's always something new. Even like we just did it in Israel with Maya Karani, it was like a completely, or Maya Leani, it's a completely different version of her that I'd never encountered before, and I was so happy to see that. And I'm actually worried that I'm getting a little too old to do it now because it's one of my favorite things is to see these different versions of Sister Helen and to see these different elements of her personality magnified and turned up to 11.
You have met and interacted with the real Sister Helen.
Oh, many times.
Yeah. Which means that you, when you're on the stage and in rehearsal, are not just bringing your interpretation of Joseph Desrochers to the women who are playing Sister Helen, but somewhere you probably in your head and your heart and behind your eyes have Sister Helen.
Yeah, yeah.
How does that interweave when you're playing the role?
Well, I mean, meetings. Have you met Sister Helen before?
Yes.
So it's a little bit like meeting the Dalai Lama, isn't it?
Yeah, true.
It has that sort. I mean, I've never met the Dalai Lama, but I can imagine that's what it's like. Man, it's like I've never met somebody that so changes a room the second they walk in. It's just like someone's shining a big spiritual light, and she's so practiced at just receiving from anybody. And there's always, when she's talking to you, you're the only person in the room. She's not looking over your shoulder, waiting for somebody else. She'll spend as much time as she needs to so that person feels like they've been heard. And so, yeah, when you're out there with somebody who's exemplifying those aspects, it is not hard to break down. It is not hard to feel that, those moments like in the Elvis scene. Oh, there he is. He's right behind me. In the Elvis scene, where they sort of get together and they sort of, they've been trying to come together, and she'd take a step and he'd take a step, he'd take a step and she'd pull back. They finally get into a rhythm when they discover they both are big Elvis fans. And that's sort of the catalyst for what actually makes him connect. That's the one unlikely connection that basically results in him being able to confess that he's done it and to be able to apologize to the family. And so,
yes, go ahead, Mike.
I mean, that's that connection to be able to. It's not hard when you can see that, you can almost see that spirit of Sister Helen coming through these incredibly talented women right at you. And like in that scene, there's some times when he just kind of looks back over his shoulder, and you see her being like, "Please, please," and that's what I always feel like with Sister Helen. She's like begging us to connect, begging us to understand, begging us to see the world from another person's perspective.
I want to identify for our listeners Jennifer Rivera a bit more. I met her, I remember the date, December 16th, 1999.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I remember the date was it was the 100th birthday of Noel Coward. And she was a student at Juilliard. And I have done programs at Juilliard through the years, and I was asked to do a program about Noel Coward,
Mm-hmm.
about his music and his role and his performance approach. And we had the baritone Keith Fairs, I think it's pronounced
I love
Phare,
Keith.
and Jennifer Rivera, then students at Juilliard, were wonderful to work with. And Jenny immediately struck me as someone with a lot more than a lot of other singers. And I don't just mean musically. There was a lot of person there.
Mm.
There was a strong moral force.
Yeah.
And I had in my notes, but I didn't say it, but I had the very same feeling about you, a very strong moral force. And I have the very same feeling about Joyce DiDonato,
Yeah.
who has that in beautiful ways. And it's not that this has to be brought around everywhere and imposed on other people, but it's something that informs the people that the three of you are. And you approach it in different ways, but I see even in your bad guy characters a very strong moral force, which makes them different, that makes them richer, more complex than others. But your Sharpless, your Marcello are very moral and very
Mm-hmm.
beautiful for that reason. Jenny answered her own call, so to speak. I think she looked at her life, her career, what she wanted in life,
Mm-hmm.
and has become very active in the well being of other artists.
Yes.
And she now heads the Long Beach Opera, and she's a
Yes.
very vocal, I mean, vocal in the sense of speaking out person about the arts, not in the most customary ways that the arts are good and we should support them, but
Mm-hmm.
their meaning. And she's a wonderful advocate for the arts. I don't know how much she's still singing or whether she put that aside, but I hear from her periodically, and she's really wonderful. And people in California, when opera companies reopen, I want you to get to know Long Beach Opera, which
Mm-hmm.
has a long history of being innovative, and she's the latest person there. Joyce DiDonato brings her consciousness to issues of war and peace,
Mm-hmm.
and does that with the music of Handel, and does it with bel canto, and part of her wonderment to me is that she does not underline for us her feelings and her policies and her politics,
Right.
but comes at it through the soul rather than through the political party, and finds the universal in all things.
Yeah.
And you, I'm going to ask you, my friend, do you do this consciously or it's just part of your makeup?
I'd say it's probably a combination. You know, it's I don't think at first I did it consciously. It just was sort of like it was the easiest way for me to tell stories. You know, I always had a hard time if I didn't believe. I gotta believe, man. I gotta believe in what I'm doing, and a lot of times that takes a lot of work. You know, there's some pieces that I've done, some newer pieces, some older pieces. I felt no connection to, and I had to dig in deep to find it. You know, and once I started finding it, it was like that sort of like I don't activist. I mean, maybe an activist, maybe, but I mean the activism, and especially the things that I push for in opera. And I'm always pushing for new works and things that actually tell people stories and people can relate to. Came from not from wanting to do that, but from seeing that work and how it affected other people. When I saw people like that look like me, that came up like me, when I see them coming along with us and they're right there, I mean, that's it. That's it. So it's that, that element inspired the activism and inspired the push for that stuff. And also, it informed incredibly my traditional standard repertoire. Because once I'm not one of these big guys like you in college. You need to be studying. You need to be singing in other languages. I think it's important to learn the stuff, but you got to learn how to sing in your own. You've got to be able to communicate in your own language, because once I really understood that emotional connection to text and language, then that was, I'm talking about mid-30s. I'm talking about early mid-30s, which is, I think, pretty standard for an artist. Sort of like, oh yeah, you know. But then I was like, oh my God, I've been up here just pretending. You know, I wasn't really connected to that text. I was singing pretty sounds, or I was imitating all these other great singers and whatnot. I wasn't being honest. And so it's that honesty that I found through English that then informed Scarpia, that informed Rigoletto. Man, that just changed the game for me with those roles. Because then I understood that emotional connection in a different way. And it stopped becoming about making beautiful sounds or being the most perfect everything or making most pearl-shaped nonsense. And it became just about making the sound of a human emotion in a way that 3,000 people could hear it. Mm-hmm. But that, you know, it's that sort of thing that's at the core of what drives me now. And that's why that's why I push these things, because, you know, when I don't connect with an audience, when I don't see that, when I don't get that reaction, I feel like I've totally failed, you know. And even like, you know, I just did in Stuttgart, I just did Iphigenie en Tauride, mm-hmm. you know, and you know, Thoas isn't exactly a character you can connect to the people with, you know. It's kind, I mean, you know, you can, but it's more tough. It's tougher.
Yeah.
And I found, you know, even there, I mean, I got there, but it was such a long journey, and it was so much harder than doing it in my own language, in my own style of music. I mean, that's pretty foreign to me.
Yeah.
But we got there, and it's still the same. I'm still speaking to that same core principle, that same core value of trying to get people to resonate with that emotional sound you're making. You know, it has nothing to do with that perfect, oh, you nailed the high note. Who gives a shit, man? I don't. I really don't. People, I'll speak to young people, some of my colleagues sometimes, but how was the C, or how was the B flat? And half the time I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about, because I don't. Once I learn the music, I forget the note values, man. I'm just singing noises, you know. So that's just never been my thing. So it's that empathy. It's that empathetic core.
In our concluding minutes, I'd like to ask you just a couple more things, because time flies when you're having fun. You are part of, or about to become a part in more palpable ways, of a community of artists in Atlanta.
Boy, am
even
I
though you're going to be living in South Carolina.
Yeah.
Atlanta Opera is a fascinating example of opera coming up from not a good situation to a fantastic situation, and is now a leading company in our country. It was not always, for reasons that I hope to talk about with the head of the company sometime in December. And talk about this this community, and how it developed and why.
Well, Tomer and I started talking about this sort of idea early on in this crisis, because we sort of saw the writing on the wall.
The crisis being the pandemic.
The pandemic, right? This COVID-19 thing we're all in the middle of now, that hopefully in a couple of years we'll be like, oh, remember that time? But I mean, 2 weeks in, I was like, this is going to be 2 years. We're all going to lose work. And sure enough, we all started losing work instantly. And I've lost all of my work, of course, until December. And that's so far, you know.
Yeah, I know.
And so what we realized was there was going to be a lot of people without work. And so if we could find a way to get to do work and work around this crisis and not let it stop our music and stop our expression and stop our storytelling, you know, I spent my entire career doing things in austere situations with limited resources, where the storytelling was the most important, and realizing you don't need to have an opera house to have an opera. I've done almost as much opera outside of an opera house as I've done inside of an opera house. And so that ethic was something Tomer and I both shared. We both understand, and he and I have been friends for a long time, and we talk all the time, and we're always on the same page about stuff. It's amazing. You know, it's kind of creepy sometimes, because he'll call me and be like, I was just going to call you. So we started working on this, and we realized there's all these singers Not only that don't have work and that are of a high level, but so many of them live in Atlanta, or they live within an hour or 2 hour drive. And in America, we've always been sort of focused on this star system. It's not really an opera unless you have your big star come in from France or Germany or Italy or whatever, and then it's a real show. And we realized that in Europe they do have these community player companies. They're called festivals, fest contracts, and we didn't have that situation in America. And I worked for 5 years at Steppenwolf Theater as a house manager and bartender and all this stuff, and that's kind of where I learned about how to act and about I watched Joan Allen, Gary Sinise, and all these great actors go through all their process and stuff, and they're all part of that ensemble. And I always thought that would be a great way to make opera, where you have the artists that are on the board, and they're all the artists are deciding what gets made, and they get to make it, and everybody just kind of gets out of their way. I thought that was the greatest idea, and all these things sort of culminate, and of course it just made sense with this pandemic that it wasn't going to be a company like the Met, or they just can't move fast enough. They're a huge ship, and they can't avoid that iceberg. But if you're in a lifeboat, you can kind of move out of the way. And that's what I think this company Players is. It's a lifeboat for our art form in America, because there's not going to be a lot of companies that are producing much at all that's not digital. But with Atlanta, we're going to be performing live theater, and we're not going to try to pretend like this pandemic's not happening. We're going to incorporate it into the storytelling, because, art should reflect culture sometimes. And I think pretending that we're not in this thing is silly. So we're doing all these social distancing things. Going to be under a big top tent. Everybody's going to be safe. He's got some advisors from the CDC down there helping him install safety procedures
Center
to make
for
sure that we're all
Disease
taken
Control for our listeners outside the
Right.
country. It just happens that our Center for Disease Control, world famous and currently beleaguered, is in Atlanta. So you have that access.
Yeah.
I actually published a couple of articles when the pandemic just hit in late March and early April at wqxr.org about opera in the times of the pandemic, and also Earth Day. And I proposed something comparable, and you're calling it a pod, but basically a community of artists who would be local. And I said that certainly the New York area has its own. And I mentioned Atlanta as another place that had a nucleus of artists. But then the other reason being that with Earth Day and our wanting to protect the world for the future, that the less carbon footprint we make, because opera singers and people work in opera like me fly around all the time, to build local communities, and not just in New York, though it's very important. As a New Yorker, we want it to be fantastic. But we have many people to call upon here. But Atlanta can do that, San Francisco, Chicago, Houston. There are places that can do that. And then broader communities like New England could do that, Boston and Connecticut and so forth, the way it's done in Europe.
Yeah, we have the talent. That's the thing, is that we have the talent.
Absolutely have the talent.
We just got hung up on this idea that unless you're bringing somebody famous in, then you're not really doing opera. And man, opera has been happening all over the country outside of New York City for a hell of a long time. And there are a lot of folks out here in our country that are talented. And I'm by no means a nationalist. I love the international nature of our business. But right now, that international nature of our business is literally cut off. I can't even leave the goddamn country.
Yeah.
So we might as well go into. That's what Megan and I have been doing. We've been playing country and bluegrass music, going back to our roots, going into ourselves, going into our community, making music as close to home as possible. And I think that's the only way we can get through. And maybe in the process we revitalize some of these more far-flung communities, and we give people a sense of civic pride. That listen, we have these are our people. These are our own townspeople that we have here. We didn't even know we had 9 opera singers that live. We have 12 people in that ensemble, plus the young artists that are going to be coming. They all either live in Atlanta or close to it, or have
people like Jamie Barton and Morris Robinson, and is Lawrence Brownlee among them as well?
No, Talise Trevine's in there.
Talise Trevine.
Trey Schmager is there. Reggie's there from Houston. Yeah, I mean, it's just a great. It's a great cross section of America as well. I mean, the Atlanta company players looks like America. Daniela and
Alex.
Daniela Max in there and Alex is there.
Yeah.
It's going to be fantastic. I mean,
Cool.
to be able to work with a local group of singers, that is at such an incredibly high level. I Ryan McKinney's going to be there. I mean, it's like the most amazing group of people. And we're going to make some amazing things. And there's literally, like talking to Tomer, there's no limits. I mean, he's actually going to us and saying, "What do you guys want to do? We're going to have all these, other opportunities to do recordings or public performances or love letters to Atlanta. What do you guys want to do?" Instead of, he's really making us as these company players take responsibility for the product we're going to produce. And I tell you what, that makes you a different kind of performer because you're invested in a way that you're not if you're just flying into town, doing your 4 rehearsals, coming in late, doing the
Yeah.
production week, and then flying back home. That's a different kind of experience. You're there in the community. You're invested. You're seeing the same people.
It's an
You're spending your
ensemble.
dollars in town.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I would come to see anything you do, but I would love to see a Così fan tutte with you. Uh, Maybe have Daniela Mack. I don't know if she would be Dorabella or Despina, but the other one would be Jamie Barton that they could alternate.
Yeah.
That would be a fun opera to do and doable because there are 6 characters and a small chorus that could be off stage. Technically, they don't have to be on the stage. So it is stageable.
Yeah.
Finally, because we could go on forever, but I want to be mindful of our time, you gave listeners a list of some of the recordings that inspire you that are found in
Yeah.
IDAGIO. One of them being Cornell McNeil as Rigoletto. I got to
Oh,
work with him a lot. Joan Sutherland in the cast and Renato Cioni. Um, you have George London, another great bass baritone. Die Fliegende Holländer, the
oh,
famous recording with Leonie Rieseneck. You have 2 works that I didn't know, one by Arvo Pärt, the other by Joby Talbot, and I listened to them and they were very meditative, I think is a
yes.
nice way to say it. Why works that were so completely meditative and perhaps abstract in the
Well,
context of all these other intense things, maybe because of that?
yeah. I mean, Joby Talbot. I fell in love with his music working on Everest, his opera about the tragic accident in 20. I forget the year now, but it was killed like 15 people. And I played the character of Beck Weathers. And the music for me was so evocative, It just felt like the mountain was alive. You could just it was a character. But it was musically personified. It's terrifying. Even to this moment, I hear the music and I hear some of the effects that he uses. It's terrifying. He did the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy soundtrack.
Yeah.
He does a lot of ballet, so he has this sort of theatrical approach to music, which I loved. And Title Harmonic was this piece that because I wanted to learn more about Joby, I started going through his catalog and I stumbled across this piece and it just kind of stuck out to me as something that was a nice piece, a really nice piece to like listen to. And it does kind of like, you sort of, it starts with the chimes. And so you sort of, it puts you in that meditative place. And when I got back from Wozzeck, and I was still struggling with grief. I'm still, to this day, I still struggle with, I've missed that dog so much. And I know for a lot of people, they don't really go, it's a dog, but like, he was like my brother. He was like the best thing. And I was sitting here in the house. I was sitting here on the floor, or on the couch, and I want to listen to that thing. And I sort of sat down, and listening to that music, it was like I got this replay of Pete's entire life in my head. I don't know how he did it, but it was like this most amazing, and I was just torn between ecstatic joy and just utter despair and grief at losing him, And it sort of took me through this panoply of emotions. And then at the end, it sort of wakes you up. And, I'm a kind of an emotional guy, as you can tell. So I immediately, after I sort of got myself together, I wrote Joby this long email about what it did and what the experience that piece gave me was. And I said, I don't know how you did it, but it just tapped into something. And he goes, Mike, that's exactly why I wrote that piece, is for people to have them deal with loss and heart and bereavement. And it just, I mean, that's pretty amazing. So that's why
Well,
that piece has
that's
spoken to me so
for
much.
millions of people and certainly 174,000 American families an
Yeah,
ideal piece to listen to, I
yeah,
think. Finally, you mentioned Nixon in China, but by John Adams and Alice Goodman, the famous opera, but very specifically Robert Orth,
yes,
the baritone who died last year.
yeah.
Um, did you know him when you lived in Chicago? He was from Chicago, and you worked at the Steppenwolf.
No, I just knew Bob from the business and working with him in some projects, and the most significant thing he and I ever did together. We did of course Dead Man Walking a couple of times together, but and the first time I ever did Dead Man Walking when I was the prison guard number 1. He was Owen Hart, the father of one of the victims, and I was young and kind of this was just starting my exposure. Frederica von Stade was the mother, and me and my friend Andy, while she's doing the confession scene, we're the first time we'd ever cried on stage. We both were just pouring, couldn't believe what we were seeing. And then watching Bob's commitment to the emotional character of this guy, and the way every time Bob says a word on stage, you never need subtitles when you watch Bob. You don't, because his diction is perfect. And then getting to know Bob, we did, getting to know him as a man and as a mentor and as a friend. He had a profound effect on me, and especially at some times when I was going through some really hard times. I would, Bob would talk to me, and of course, Bob was always a happy guy. He's always like, Mike, I don't really understand. Like, I'm happy. I don't. I mean, but I can. For a guy that could play these characters and cry and do all this stuff on stage, he was a very happy man all the way to the end of his life.
Yeah.
But we did Out of Darkness, which is the story, which for a looker a touch is Jake Hagee's, just the part of the story about Gadford and Gad and Manfred, a gay couple that was, torn apart by the Holocaust. One ends up dying in the concentration camp, and one survives. And the one that survives is played by an actor, and the one who dies in the prison camp is the only one who sings. Well, Bob played the acting part, and I have never in my life worked with somebody on stage where the director just didn't have to do anything. He just sat there and watched. He was like, that looks good. And Bob and I didn't have to even talk to each other. We just played the scene. And we never even said, what about this moment or that moment? Or no, we just played it every time. And it was just unspoken, magical thing. I mean, I could still feel him, like at the very end of the show. They kind of hug and dance, and I have his hand on my head on my shoulder. I can still feel him to this day. And the reason I chose that particular recording in Nixon is I just did Nixon for the first time in Stuttgart, and I'd listened to a lot of recordings, and try to see what other people have done. And then I went through the text myself, and of course, then I knew that Bob's was out there, and I listened to it last. And then I was like, right, I could see the emotional complexity of this guy. And actually sort of just listening to it, I actually kind of felt sorry for him at the end. Imagine feeling sorry for Richard Nixon. Crazy. But Bob can make you do that. Bob can make you do that. And I wanted people to have that same experience with me.
Glad that you acknowledged him because he was one of those figures who we certainly knew and loved in American opera, but he wasn't famous necessarily. But he was an outstanding artist who had a great career and made the art form better,
Mm-hmm.
as you do. And I do hope that as a result of our conversation today, people who never knew Michael Mays have gotten to know him a bit. And if you are in Atlanta the next period, that's where I guess you'll find him. And then when the pandemic is, we hope, behind us and we can go back into our world, people will return to opera and find Michael Mays on all the great stages of the world. I thank you, my friend. I
Thank you so much,
appreciate it.
Fred.
Okay. And I
All
look
right.
forward to seeing you soon.
I can't wait, man.
Okay. Take care.
I'll see you.